passion for ideas. I knew him over a very long time. I respected him greatly. In fact, I should say I was extremely fond of him, had a great deal of affection for him. Quite often in the old days, we would travel back together. It so happens that we would be traveling back together from Trivandrum to Delhi when Comrade Balanandan was a member of parliament. And while I would use the long flight to get a bit of nap or to do a crossword or something, Comrade Balanandan would always be reading and reading books, reading serious stuff. He had a great passion for ideas. It is therefore proper that the major initiative, the first major initiative, I'm told, of the E. Balanandan Research Foundation is to organize or to participate in this seminar, which is centered on a topic which currently is rocking the country. The fact that corruption is a major social issue, the fact that corruption has got to be stopped to the extent possible, and the fact that anti-corruption legislation is one way of doing so are all undeniable. But at the same time, when we are looking at the issue of corruption, the question that immediately arises is whether corruption is the cause of our social problems or is it a symptom of our social problems. Linked to it is a deeper issue. What exactly is corruption? Now, it's not for me to use this opportunity to define what is corruption, but I'd like to draw a couple of distinctions. The first thing I'd like to say is that in the entire discussion in India on corruption, starting, for instance, from the Prevention of Corruption Act, corruption has been looked at essentially as episodic, that if a public servant obtains a gratification in excess of his or her legal emoluments for doing an undue favor to somebody, then that is corruption. In other words, corruption is related to an act. It is related to an episode. But one can think of corruption in a sense which is no less important as consisting, for instance, utilizing one's political contact or contact with the state in order to do undue favors, for instance, to a firm and obtaining not gratification for it, but because one may in fact be obtaining over a long period some advantages, not a gratification specifically linked to an act, but a gratification that's over a prolonged period, and an act which is not an act, but itself a series of favors over a prolonged period. This, for instance, happens when you have people of the corporate sector who actually infiltrate the state. Now, this is a very standard practice in every capitalist country. I don't know if the United States, where it ranks in the corruption index, but we know that two top executives of Bechtel Corporation, George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger, were members of a US administration. Shultz was the Secretary of State, Weinberger was the Secretary of Defense. We know that Dick Cheney, the Vice President of the United States in the last administration, was a person who actually belonged to Halliburton. And Halliburton got masses of contracts because of the Iraq war, in which Dick Cheney had a hand. But on the other hand, it is not as it were an episode. It's not as if a contract that you could prove for which Dick Cheney received money from Halliburton and because of which Dick Cheney gave that contract to Halliburton. But it's a process. The point is, Cheney is an executive or was an executive of Halliburton, would be drawing a pension from them when he retires, and that pension is something which makes him, in a sense, continue as, in some sense, in gratitude to that company, and at the same time, Dick Cheney, as that company's executive, is also the Vice President of the United States, a major voice for launching the Iraq War, from which Halliburton was a major gainer. So you see, we can think of corruption as being systemic. Yesterday in the newspapers in Delhi, there was an item according to which Mr. Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, who's currently an interlocutor in the Middle East negotiations, has used that position of being interlocutor in order to push for advantages to the firm in which he currently happens to be employed. So you find that, this is something which again may not be corruption in the sense that 1988 Prevention of Corruption Act defines it, but when you have such close enmeshing of the state personnel with the corporate sector, an enmeshing which the Austrian economist Rudolf Hilferding, on whose work Lenin relied heavily in writing his book on imperialism, had called personal union. You have a personal union, according to Hilferding, between industry and finance, and you have a personal union between industry, finance, and the state personnel. This personal union takes the form not only of these gentlemen, a group of gentlemen who dominate government, who dominate the realm of finance, who dominate the realm of politics. These gentlemen, not only in that sense, in the administration, push for a set of policies that actually bring benefits to their specific corporate world or the corporate world in general. But what is more, you also have a situation where even when they are in government, they know that there will be a sinecure after retirement in the corporate world. A very large number of government personnel these days, secretaries or even ministers. Tony Blair was one example I gave you. After retirement, they become officials in the various corporations. Many of the government secretaries become public relations, become advisors and public relations, consultants. So this is something which is negotiated. Now this enmeshing, that personal union is something which itself is a major act of corruption, except that it's not an episodic act of corruption. So we should actually draw a distinction between corruption that is episodic, against which the entire anti-corruption struggle in India has taken place, and corruption that is systemic, against which nobody till now in the anti-corruption struggle, to my knowledge, has raised his or her voice. Even if and of course we know about lobbying and so on, you have people, and when Enron says, Mr. Chidambaram, a great corporate lawyer, was also a lawyer to several multinational corporations. Now, the point is that to what extent his being the finance minister enabled him to take a softer stand on many of the issues involving these corporate houses. Now, these are very important moot questions. When you say corruption being episodic, the implicit assumption is that there are a bunch of people in the state who are separate. There are a bunch of people outside who are separate. That the latter bunch gives a bribe to the former bunch in order to get a favor. But what about if the two bunches are the same? If the two bunches are the same, then you have an institutionalized basis for corruption, and of course the two bunches increasingly become the same in the era of corporate capitalism, monopoly capitalism, finance capitalism, call it what you like, which is the topic of the present seminar. But let me get back to corruption in the narrow sense, in which we all have been concerned with. The whole country has been concerned with, namely episodic corruption, against which the Jan Lokpal Bill, for instance, or the Lokpal Bill is oriented. Now there, when we say that corruption has increased, there's no doubt, as Professor Panikkar said, Justice Hegde said, corruption has increased greatly. There is a puzzle. The puzzle is the following, that we all knew that in Nehru's time or in Indira Gandhi's time, we had this quota license permit Raj. We had a greater degree of discretion of the state in allocating inputs, in allocating licenses, in allocating finance and so on. Who it went to made a big difference to the fortunes of the person it went to. And therefore, corruption was supposed to be endemic in such quota license permit Raj. If you have liberalization so that, the market as it were takes over, the discretion as far as state personnel are concerned is minimized, then one would have thought that corruption should have come down. In the era of neoliberal policies, one would have expected corruption to come down, whereas we find that it has gone up greatly. And that's a real puzzle. Why is it that it has gone up greatly? I think, to my mind, the fundamental reason it has done so is because I think we ought to distinguish between two things. The one thing is, as it were, within a certain economic regime, what is happening to corruption. By economic regime, I mean, let's say within a certain property regime. You have some public sector units, you have some private sector units in the country. Property relations are defined, the boundaries of public and private sector are well known. Each of these sectors follows some rules of the game in obtaining for itself finance, license, inputs, whatever. Those rules of the game being changed in a manner where the discretion of the bureaucrats is minimized is likely to reduce corruption. So if we had remained within the old configuration of property regime, then it's quite likely that corruption might have come down. I have my own objections to neoliberalism. But at least as far as this area is concerned, it's conceivable that neoliberalism would have brought it down. As a matter of fact, many people like Kaushik Basu have been arguing that the way to get rid of corruption is actually to legalize it. When they say legalize corruption, what they mean is that let the market do everything. Forget about any discretion whatsoever. Now, the point is, at the same time, however, neoliberalism does not just mean an elimination of discretion within a property regime, it means a change in the property regime. And what is happening fundamentally in contemporary India is a massive change in the structure of property. Public sector property is being sold to the private sector. You have a situation where small property, petty property, like of the peasants, is being appropriated by the corporates. You have a situation where common property is being appropriated by a few monopolists. We have a massive process of Marx had called primitive accumulation of capital. If you have state property, what is state property? State property is fundamentally built up out of the money of numerous taxpayers. It is public property, it belongs to the public. Common property, petty property, all of it is increasingly being appropriated by a few. If that is the case, we have this massive process of primitive accumulation of capital, then that increases the scope for corruption. Why? Let me just give you an example. If you have, let's say, 2G spectrum. What's 2G spectrum? Something which is a property of the government is being privatized. And it is being privatized for a price that is much less than what the market would in fact have provided. The 1.76 lakh crore loss to the exchequer. Suppose, let's for a moment assume that Mr. Raja allegedly had not been a party to this at all, that no minister had taken a penny out of the 2G spectrum privatization. The loss to the exchequer would still have been 1.76 lakh crores. But there would have been no corruption. You see, corruption is, as it were, a levy which the political class imposes on the gains that the corporates are making on the primitive accumulation of capital. Whether or not there is that levy, primitive accumulation would go on. And that is the cause of the poverty. In other words, when we are looking at corruption as being the cause of the poverty, we are actually, in a sense, looking at, misplaced identity in analyzing what lies at the root of the persisting poverty. I'll just come back to it in a moment. Just look at all the major scams, the Reddys. What were the Reddys doing? The Reddys were exploiting without paying money to the state on mines which they were running. In other words, they too were appropriating state property. You look at this oil. After all, there was a time that oil exploration was a monopoly of the state. The privatization of that is associated with the loss to the exchequer, and of course a part of the loss to the exchequer, some individual ministers or bureaucrats in fact appropriate for themselves. It's as if I, as a minister, under me is a state property. I say that, listen, why don't I give this state property to somebody I know for a song? And in the process, there is a loss of 100 rupees, let us say, to the exchequer, because the price that it would have commanded in the market, if it had been auctioned, would have been 100, but I'm just giving it away like that. Or let's say for 2 rupees, then the loss to the exchequer is 98. I may then say that, listen, out of that 98, please give me 10. In which case, the person who is the beneficiary of the primitive accumulation of capital at the expense of state property gets 88, I get 10. The total loss is 98. Corruption, in other words, determines the sharing of the benefits of primitive accumulation of capital between the political class and the corporate sector. Of course, they are in cahoots and so on. But nonetheless, it is the loss to the exchequer which arises not from the fact of corruption, it arises from the fact of the primitive accumulation of capital. And these days, there is, as you know, under neoliberalism, a massive process of primitive accumulation of capital. I'll give you an example. In Bombay, the Centaur Hotel was privatized. It was privatized when Mr. Shourie was the minister. I have no reason to believe that the minister made a penny out of it. But within a few weeks of privatization, that same Centaur Hotel was sold to another party for a price that was several times the price at which it was privatized. There was, in other words, a massive loss to the exchequer. So the loss to the exchequer did not arise because of corruption. The loss to the exchequer arose because of privatization. It arose because of the process of primitive accumulation of capital. It arose because state property was handed over to a private entity for a song. Of course, if it had been auctioned, if it had been sold at the market price, then there would have been no loss to the exchequer. But since it was privatized for a song, there was a loss to the exchequer. So the loss to the exchequer is there, whether or not the minister gets a cut out of it, whether or not there is corruption. In a certain sense, therefore, looking at corruption and missing out the fact that contemporary big-ticket corruption arises because of this huge process of primitive accumulation of capital that's going on is really to look at the wrong target. And that is something which I have felt about the current anti-corruption movement. Now, this primitive accumulation of capital that's going on is, again, as Professor Panikkar said, is a real hallmark of neoliberal economic policies. In fact, neoliberalism does not just mean, as is generally made out, that it's that market takes over from the state. Neoliberalism means, above all, a process of primitive accumulation of capital being unleashed on society, where public property, common property, petty property are in fact appropriated at throwaway prices by the corporates, by the multinational corporations, by big capital. This is something which is visible in the peasants' land being taken over for all kinds of enterprises in the name of industrialization. This is visible in mineral wealth being exploited in a manner where the state gets very little by all kinds of private fellows, because state property in mines is handed over for operation to all kinds of persons, and this is visible in 2G spectrum elsewhere. This is not only happening in India, it's also happening in China. You may have seen that in China there are numerous mining accidents. You know, you keep reading in the papers that, you know, there was a mine. The reason for that mining accident, there are a lot of the mines which are actually controlled by local administration, are simply exploited by all kinds of private fellows who may be giving some amount, some throwaway amount to the local administration, but the local administration nonetheless allows those private persons to operate these mines without due regard to the hazards that are associated, with a due regard to taking precautions against the hazards to the lives of the miners. It is in fact super exploitation of the mines and of the miners by a bunch of private fellows who do so because of the fact that the local administration has allowed them to do so. It's another process of primitive accumulation of capital. A huge process of primitive accumulation of capital is on in our country, in China, elsewhere in the third world. All of it is really symptomatic of this era of neoliberal economic policies, and all of it then creates scope. They produce the base on which corruption thrives. Now, of course, you may say that, look, if we have this anti-corruption legislation, then that is going to prevent the process of primitive accumulation of capital, because if politicians are not going to get a cut, then they are unlikely to privatize state property for a song. Maybe, but let us be clear about one thing. The process of privatization is not something which is because of the whims of individual politicians. It is in fact a part of the neoliberal policies. It's a part of the World Bank's diktat to the third world country. The World Bank actually says that, look, privatization is a good thing. If you want to create an appropriate atmosphere for privatization, then you must privatize some state property at cheap prices. In other words, that, as it were, gets people interested in buying state property, and therefore they come. So it's not, let's not delude ourselves only by thinking that a Raja is responsible. It is part of the overall policy regime under neoliberalism that state property must be privatized, but privatized for a song. Now, in this connection, to me, anyone who demands anti-corruption legislation without raising a voice against privatization is either naive or dishonest. And I say it in all seriousness. I feel absolutely amazed that all the cases which are being discussed in public are cases to do with the throwaway of state property, but nobody is saying anything about the property relations. Either they are naive or in fact it is dishonest. And what is more, and this is the danger, when we talk about corruption, we are exclusively looking at the state, we are looking at private, we are looking at officials, we are looking at politicians, we are looking at ministers and so on. An impression is created that corruption resides in the state. If corruption resides in the state, in that case, state expenditure is no good because there will be a lot of corruption from it. Therefore, cut back on welfare programs. Therefore, impose austerity, therefore have tax rebates. Why should I pay a tax if the proceeds of my tax then go for all kinds of schemes where a bunch of crooks are basically siphoning off money? In other words, the kind of neoliberal program, the kind of program of austerity which is now being talked about in the US in the midst of recession and unemployment, that cut taxes, cut government expenditures, especially cut welfare expenditures, because the poor are least able to defend the fact that they are the beneficiaries of the welfare expenditures. They are at least able to, as it were, prevent leakages from expenditures meant for them. Therefore, that would be the first target. Consequently, it seems to me that unless we locate corruption in the overall context of the policy change that has taken place, in the overall context of primitive accumulation of capital, we would be in danger of actually marching with the austerity brigade. I would suggest that at least three things, to start with, at least three things should be done. The first is that, okay, of course there should be a Lokpal bill, fine. But together with it, I think all measures of privatization are measures which should be scrutinized by Parliament. It should not be simply a decision of the executive. Let it be scrutinized by Parliament, let it be scrutinized by a parliamentary committee, and let the parliamentary committee invite all kinds of people, whoever is interested, to come and offer evidence to it. So at least that would be some check. I know these days Parliament is not very popular, but I still feel that there will be some check. Let privatization at least be approved by Parliament after scrutiny. The second thing I would like to say is that let all mineral resources be both owned and operated by the state. That used to be the policy in the old days, and that must continue to be the policy, because trusting private entities to run even or operate even state-owned mineral resources is something which necessarily means an overexploitation, not only of those resources, but also of the labor engaged in extracting those resources. It becomes a part of the process of primitive accumulation of capital. The third, I would suggest, is of course one very major area of corruption is when it relates to scarce resources like land. Every land transactions. We cannot nationalize land because it's too big a step. We do not have the political agreement on that at this moment. But on every land transaction, let there be a state-owned entity that has the right of first purchase at a price which is fixed according to certain norms. That would prevent speculation, and if it prevents speculation, then of course it would get rid of a major source of corruption as far as our political life is concerned. I mean, things like Bombay, for instance, are notorious that large numbers of politicians are basically owned by the land mafia. I would suggest that these themselves don't stop primitive accumulation of capital, but they do put some kind of a brake on primitive accumulation of capital. And if we are talking about anti-corruption legislation, it must be supplemented by some such things. Of course, ultimately, the process of primitive accumulation of capital can only be reversed if simultaneously we actually have a political struggle against it. It's a part of the neoliberal regime, neoliberal dispensation, so it requires a political struggle. Unless that political struggle happens, let's be very clear, there is not going to be any reduction of poverty. Poverty in societies like ours arises because, on the one hand, there is a primitive accumulation of capital going on, squeeze, dispossession of all kinds of small producers, petty producers, common exclusion from common property, etc. But on the other hand, those who are victims of it don't even get absorbed in the expanding corporate sector, because the expanding corporate sector witnesses jobless growth. So if there is one sector from which property is being snatched away, they are being thrown more and more into distress and dispossession. On the other hand, they cannot be absorbed in the thriving, growing sector. Then it's natural that the high rate of growth would in fact be accompanied by an absolute impoverishment of large segments of the population. All this trickle down is an absurdity, does not work. We had heard of inclusive growth in the 11th five-year plan. We are hearing of inclusive growth in the 12th five-year plan. During these 5 years, whatever data exists show an increase in malnutrition in this country. So overcoming poverty requires a bigger challenge, meeting a bigger challenge, namely overcoming this process, at least to start with, of primitive accumulation of capital. But at least the symptom of primitive accumulation of capital that shows itself in the form of corruption, even that requires much more than simply passing a Lokpal bill. Thank you.